Thank you for the intro. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Quite an audience so far. So I'm excited to talk about moths. Usually, people aren't nearly as excited to hear me talk about moths. So hopefully, you guys enjoy the show. I was telling our moderators before we started the show that I, like many other scientists, tend to be long-winded, and when we review things that we consider of value or importance, usually that comes down to everything. And so I've included everything in this. I'm going to try to get through it a little quick. I want to leave a lot of time at the end for questions, so you guys can feel free to quiz me, ask me things that may benefit you or help you out in your journey to study, look at, observe, and support the moths. So yeah, as Tim was saying, I am the pesticide educator. It's not a role that I had considered being a part of, but it's one that I greatly appreciated and super proud to be involved with. And I'm with South Dakota State University Extension. So my education started in Arkansas as an undergraduate, ended in Arkansas at a different university for my doctorate, and the entire time during my graduate studies, I studied butterflies and moths. So I am more than happy to share as much as I know about these things. It's not going to be as much as I know, but it'll be some. And I can tell you, just the more you know, and the more you realize you don't know much. And I may have 5% of the information of the full breadth of knowledge about moths out there. So yeah, here we've got a show here about the role of moths in ecosystems. You got a couple pictures here that really highlight the big roles, right? So we're talking about pollinators, they're food sources, they're excellent food sources, and they are recyclers and distributors of nutrients in the form of eating and pooping everywhere. And so I want to kind of give you an outline of how we're going to be exploring these things. So first, I want to look at moth evolution. How do these things come about? Why are they valuable in the ways that we think they are? And how did the evolution contribute to their roles? The characteristics that make them good at what they do. And of course, we'll look at specific ecosystem roles. And I'm going to look at both pestilent and beneficial roles. That way, so we get a full look. And with that, I'm going to do a little bit of philosophy, my philosophy. How do I come to terms with the fact that these things are some of the largest pests of our agriculture, and yet they're so profoundly beneficial in so many ways. Uh, it's important to kind of review that and think about that. So I'll give you a little bit of my philosophy. Then we'll look at some moths in the Midwest, and we'll look at some gardening, how to support those things. So first, moth evolution. We'll look at some evolutionary predecessors. We'll look at the fossils of early moths, or what we believe are fossils of early moths. There is evidence of a guy going through the process of doing some genetic work with a quote unquote fossil. It turned out to be a leaf. So mistakes are made, but when we pull out that genetic material, we can relate it back to an animal that is currently alive. So they are able to figure out if they're dealing with a stick or something that is not a moth. But then we'll look at some ancient characteristics and the prevailing theory about the origin of moths, and we'll look at some extant moths as well. So this is the full view, Smithsonian view of DNA barcoding view of insect evolution. Starts over here, Diplura, Protura. These aren't insects. These are um, predecessors to the insects. And you can see what we're going to be looking at over here are going to be the caddisflies. Those are going to be your predecessors. Your micro moths, which are oftentimes some of the earlier moths, but we have some micro moths that are more modern, you might say, more derived species. And then we'll look at macro moths and butterflies. And I cannot stress enough that butterflies, we love to call them something different. We don't do that with any other group. If there's a day flying group of beetles, they're still beetles. If there's a night flying group of beetles, and there are both, they're still beetles. So with moths and butterflies, we did this weird thing where they're called different. The butterflies are just day flying moths. And that's how I'll treat them. So evolutionary predators, like I said, we're going to look at Trichoptera, the caddisflies. You can see these things. You got a lot of hair here. So you can see a lot of the hair that's coming off. One of the characteristics of moths is being really hairy. And we probably know that just from looking at moths. But you can see these things are pretty hairy. They've got some of the spurs that you see on the legs of moths. They've got kind of the general shape, gestalt of moths. But oftentimes these things have much longer antennae, and very importantly, they have mandibles, so chewing mandibles instead of a long proboscis that most moths have. But as we find out, in early stages of the evolution of moths, they were actually, and we still have micropterigids, which are mandibulate moths. So they feed on pollen, they feed on nectar as well, but they are actually chewing this stuff up rather than sucking it through a long proboscis, which is something that came a little bit later. Right here at Angiospermivora. So the angiosperm feeding, basically they're feeding on plants and on flowers as well. So about that time we get the proboscis. And then we get down here are the more derived moths, starting with Galechioidea. So your Galechiids, your pterophorids, geometrids, noctuids, your drepanids, saturniids, all the way down to your lasiacampids and your sphingids. These are some of the moths that we commonly think of because they're larger. They tend to be a little bit bigger, more visible, and they're more modern. So, and oftentimes much more colorful, but you'll see just in a second that that's not always the case. And we pull back a little bit here. Let's look at the full view. Again, we started here with mandibulate moths. Then we've got into angiosperms. Now we're feeding on plants. We've got a proboscis here. Now we're feeding on flower nectar. Well, that really kicked off. Now we get huge branches or very long. You can see here just loads of species. As soon as they tapped into nectar as a adult food source, boom, it opened up the world. They spread out massive. And then you can see here are butterflies right in the middle of moths. Now we can rearrange this in many different ways, but moths tend to fall out just before some of the more modern things that we call moths, like sphinx moths. So sphinx moths are actually more derived than some of the butterflies. So an interesting story there again, butterflies are just day flying moths. So here's a prevailing theory here. This is work done by a gentleman down in Florida. Excellent work. This is the same guy that I told you about, found a leaf as a purported moth fossil, and later found out it was a leaf. He, of course, removed that data and generated this map here. And what we find interesting is if we look at the evolution of angiosperms, a lot of this lines up extremely well. And so the prevailing theory right now is that moths not only likely had something to do with the early evolution of angiosperms, as in like their breakout, but also the subsequent like 150, 170, 200 million years of angiosperm evolution. So moths are key players in the role of angiosperms becoming dominant in our environment, as well as big, beautiful. They have everything to do with that. And here's some of the evidence here. So we go back to, 200,000, 200 million years ago. Sorry, 200 million years ago. We've got some fossils. These were found in Germany. Some of the areas in Germany are very good for preserving fossils. So we've got some scales. Scales are unique to Lepidoptera. We've dated them to about 206 million years ago. So we are certain that the evolution of moths had occurred prior to that point. Why else would we be finding scales as fossils for moths unless they predated that? And so the oldest fossil moth that we have is about 190 million years ago, so quite a long time. And what's interesting here is the oldest bee fossil falls out about 100 million years ago. And so we've got this long relationship between angiosperms, which actually started happening around here. And we actually have proposals all the way back to 300 million years ago for the first angiosperms. So we've got this long-term relationship between moths and flowers. Bees didn't show up until later. So we recognize those. Oh, they're really important pollinators, and they are very important, and they are exceptionally good at it. But we've got a very long relationship between moths. So don't discredit moths just because we don't see them as often, because when they fly at night. So some moth characteristics. First and foremost, moths are insects. They have 4 stages of life. This is really important to their success, and I'll talk about why. Their mouth parts are proboscis, so long feeding tube, straw-like mouth parts. That's important as well. Scales, they're exceptionally hairy. They have very good vision. You might be surprised when you learn a little bit more. Their smell is exceptional as well. Their hearing, it's not nearly as good, but they do hear, and it is important when we think about what we need to do to support these animals. First of all, insects, right? So insects have three general body parts: the head, which is for sensing things and for feeding as well, right? So it's where you see your mouth parts, you see your eyes for seeing light, the antennae for detecting chemicals, and this sort of how you can think of smell. Your thorax here, which is going to be for locomotion. You got your legs, your wings for flying and walking. Your abdomen, really, it's for digestion and reproduction. And one of the things that's really important here is that they're segmented. Insects are all segmented. It's really important. They're called arthropods for a reason. Um, and yeah, this is the general look of what an insect is in the framework of a moth. So moths are insects. Um, this picture shouldn't be here. So unfortunately, it kind of reveals where we're going. This is my picture, but we're actually following Cecropia moth here. These are Cecropia larvae. They tend to feed on maple and some other trees in the area, and so you can't actually find these things. Then you get to the larvae. Now, the separation between larvae and adult is exceptionally important. These larvae, this adult actually doesn't have a mouth part. A lot of these large Saturniids, they don't even feed as adults. How is that even possible? Well, it turns out they eat so much as caterpillars, they don't need to feed. When you look across the board, across all the other moths, most of these caterpillars, these are the ones that are doing most of the eating, right? So they go through, they tear into the vegetation. They're the pests. They're the ones that cause the problems for the plants that we try to grow. Um, we'll look later and see that pest is just a word, right? Pest. But caterpillars, they get very big, very large, but they're not competing with these adults. The adults, again, they have a proboscis. They can't chew vegetation. They drink liquid meals. They drink nectar, they drink sugary water. They may take some drinks out of a mud puddle for salts, but they're not competing with food sources with their larvae, which is incredibly important. If you look at some of the earlier insects, you've got adults that feed the same thing as larvae. And so if you get into a competitive state, you'll find that the adults actually outpace the larvae or the young, and they could actually get rid of them. And so you potentially kill your early generation just because you are out feeding them. You don't have that problem with Lepidoptera. Important thing about moths, the cocoon. Recognize that the cocoon is just the silken case here. This is a chrysalis wrapped in a silken case. It's called a cocoon for that reason. Many moths create cocoons. Not all of them do. These silk moths do. This is a large royal silk moth called a Cecropia. It's a native, very big and beautiful. This is my own picture found in my backyard. You'll see how much joy I got out of this in just a second. It's a bit of a nerdy picture, but of course the adults reproduce, generate the eggs. The cycle starts all over again. So here's an example of the. I'm just gonna grab my phone real quick, check the time. Okay, good. We're good on time. We've got a proboscis. You can see it's hollow here. This is where they feed from the nectar. This is the distal portion, so the lower part of the proboscis, the very bottom part. It's a little smaller and it opens up. So they generate these muscular movements that create a negative pressure that help them suck in these fluids. As it turns out, they coil up nicely. Not all of them have them, but when they do, they coil up nicely and they fit really nicely into their mouth. And there's structure here that you don't necessarily see. So a lot of the surface area helps the animal grab. It's for surface tension, right? So liquid will cling to this sort of tooth-like structure here, and it helps them feed. It also helps them pick up pollen. And as it turns out, a lot of these guys from their proboscis exude liquids that can digest that pollen, that offer them certain protein and nutrients they don't otherwise have access to because they don't have chewing mouthparts. So this is incredibly advantageous. Not just for feeding on nectar, but also for acquiring different nutrients that are not necessarily provided in nectar. And this is one of the ways that they act to carry pollen between flowers. Scales. So if we just break down the name Lepidoptera, which is the order for moths and butterflies, it actually means scale wing. And so when we start taking close looks here, we start to see some pretty incredible structure. We see some combs, we see some straight lines here, just some dense hair looking stuff. As it turns out, when you get into it, you see this sort of diversity of scales across the board from smooth to combed. This would be on the wing. This is also on the wing to hairy to structures that are on the head. That are going to be much longer. By the way, these are actually the animals from which these pictures were taken. This is a uranid, moth you can find in the tropics. This is a butterfly. It's a swallowtail butterfly, but I really just wanted to display how these scales contribute to color. And look at the diversity here. one of the most important things that we contribute to bees for being good pollinators is that they are just loaded with hairs. They are packed with hairs, and really importantly, the Anthophilus, the species that really like flowers, have branched hairs. Well, let's just look at these scales. I mean, you can just look at the branching here, and then when we look at an animal that's visiting a lot of flowers, these are all pollen granules. So when we think about an animal being good at being a pollinator, the most important aspect is that they're actually transferring pollen from one flower to the next. Bees, we know, visit flowers. They collect that pollen intentionally to use for feeding their larvae. They pack it into balls, they put it on their legs, put it on their abdomens and other places in order to transport it to a nest where they pack it into a ball for food for their larvae. Moths aren't feeding anything with it, and so a lot of this is incidental. It's not intentional, but in fact, it's not going to get stuck there. And so their transfer rate, it tends to be way better. And so when we look in general, we find that moths tend to be more efficient as pollinators. They're transferring a greater number of pollen grains and a lot further distances. Vision. Moths have some of the best night vision that you can imagine. They have muscles inside of their eyes. So it looks like this has a pupil. Really, all it is just the absorption of light. It creates the illusion of a pupil. At any one time, these are all called ocelli. They're little tiny ball, little tiny cubes, little tiny eyes packed together all over their head. And they're always active. Can't just turn it off. So there's no pupil, there's no eyelid. But what they can do is they can control how much light gets in. And so here we've got just one of these little stemma here, and then the light comes in, and we can actually block it and direct it towards a specific thing. Now, that's really good for seeing at night, right? Because then we can take all the light that's available, concentrate it, and generate an image that's going to be beneficial for us. Well, it turns out they do more than that, right? So it turns out they're not just controlling and making sure that they capture as much light as they possibly can. Um, they are also delaying the signal that goes to their brain. So this is it's called summation, temporal summation. And so as the light comes in, if it's not enough, they'll just delay that signal. It has to reach a certain point, and then once they get the signal, they can get a clear spatial summation here of what a flower. It's a little blurry, right? So we're not getting the day clarity here, but we're getting pretty close. And that is incredibly important for their ability to visit, recognize, and visit flowers, land on them, and be able to take a nectar drink. There's also spatial summation. And so if I move back and forth, I can capture more light. Again, delay the signal that goes to my brain, but capture all the light from all sorts of different places. It becomes a little bit blurrier, but it is an actionable image that I can recognize this flower. I could potentially even visit the corolla and get myself a nectar drink. Moths have a very, very strong sense of smell, but it's very, very specific. These are some examples of what some antennae look like. The ones that you just saw, they're called plumose or bipectinate. And they're really common in some butterflies and or in moths, the sphingids, not so much, but the royal silk moths. And what they're actually picking up on is very specific. So they're not smelling everything. They don't have the full breadth of smell that we might have, but they can pick up benzoyl acetate or linalool, which are two common floral aromatic compounds. They detect those far better than we can. As far as a kilometer away, they could detect these things, and then they'll come in from that far just to find a nectar drink. I had another image here. It looks like I missed it. It's too bad. They also hear. A lot of their hearing is for avoiding predation. And so for the hearing, it's kind of similar with the sense of smell. It's very specific. It's only a couple frequencies that they're able to pick up on. But if you have just general noise out in your backyard, it's possible that it will confuse the moths. They might be able to pick up that frequency. They may think that there's just loads of bats out there. So ambient noise is an important thing to try to control whenever you're trying to support these animals. We've seen the evolution of ears happen several times over the course of moths. In all cases, it's to prevent predation, like I said. So it's always for bats, I guess in some cases they are helpful in locating other moths that emit sound, but again, very specific frequencies to avoid bats. And so let's start with some ecosystem roles. We'll start with pestilence because that's I think the thing that we most commonly think about. At least the folks that I talk to most often, which tend to be ag folks. So um, they are huge pests. They're pests of clothing. I'm sure you've heard of clothing moths. If you've ever had that mothball smell that we always try to associate with our grandmother, or our grandparents, right? That's a smell that comes from them. Well, it turns out they're just protecting their clothes. Clothes moths are problematic for any organic material used to create clothes. Stored food, prop, habitat, and then of course human roles in the pestilence. We got to look at all that to really understand what's going on. Cloth moths, again, they'll eat cotton, they'll eat wool, they'll eat, there's preferences there, but they will go after just about anything you might have in your closet. The larvae, they don't eat a heck of a lot, but when you have huge numbers, these holes can turn in pretty massive. This is what the adults look like. This is just a case-bearing closed moth, and this is just a closed moth. So they tend to be Tanaids. It's a type of micromoth family, and it's a little bit older, but they feed very well on these things. Um, I would use cedar chips if you have a problem with these things. Just toss them in your closet. It smells a lot better than mothballs. It turns out naphthalene has some side effects that are not good. You don't want to put naphthalene mothballs into your closet. Stored food consumers, if you guys store like oatmeal or corn or any kind of grain, you might have run into this Indian meal moth. It's much more common in your residential operations. So just like storing your grain inside your house, that's generally where you're going to find Indian meal moths. They don't get that bad in grain bins and grain storage, but the one that does is this Anguimois grain moth here, and it's a real problem. It'll bore into corn, the larvae will develop, it'll bore out of the corn, turn into this moth here, or a different morph here, darker morph, but they are super problematic, billions of dollars in damage overall around the globe. Crop consumers. This is one I try to focus on things that we grow in our backyard. Cutworms here. This is a dingy cutworm over in the top right. These things cut the base of the plant. They suck the fluids from the cut point. They don't even feed on the rest of the plant. They just cut it down, take a little bit of that nutrient from the plant that's been cut off, and then move on and cut down the next one. Super problematic. They'll just leave just loads of dead plants. This is tobacco hornworm. They can defoliate a single animal this size, and they get this big pretty quick. So their development period's really fast. I'm sure if you've had them, you've seen them go from maybe tiny caterpillars, if you didn't even notice them, to very big, very fast. They could defoliate an entire tomato plant. They eat on other things, and once they get done, they'll go after the fruit. This is one of my favorites. This is a squash borer. Super beautiful. A Ceciad, just absolutely beautiful moth, orange, blues, metallic colors, reflective. They will destroy your squash. They'll bore into it. They get in there and they just basically eat around. They damage the plant itself. It can't transport its nutrients to its tip. It ends up breaking, becomes flimsier. It becomes less good at like generating your squash. So real problem there, but so pretty as an adult. Same thing with the dingy moth, right? They're habitat destroyers, moths can be. And so this is a box tier moth. It is really problematic in a lot of your shrubs, especially in the Midwest. It is an introduced species. Most of the ones that are going to do major damage are going to be introduced species, just like this one. This is called a spongy moth. It used to be called a gypsy moth. We've steered away from using the word gypsy because of the potential offense that it carries. So it's a spongy moth named after its egg cases. Their egg sacs are blobs of spongy look, and they cover it with silk, so it's really interesting looking. But they can defoliate an entire forest. I mean, you can see these trees over here almost completely devoid of any leaves, and then you can see just how much of an effect they can have. It's a lot. But it's important to understand like how this happens. As it turns out, gypsy or the spongy moths, They were brought in by this gentleman here, Truvolo. He was an artist, and he wanted to generate a silk industry in the United States using some resident silk moth. Well, the resident silk moths, while they generate silk, they don't survive very well during cultivation, unlike some of the Asian species that are used to generate the clothing silk that we wear commonly. So he imported from Europe that gypsy or spongy moth, and he brought it here and he was rearing it. Well, guess what happened? They got away. They got away from him. He thought he was going to generate $1 billion business, and instead he just infected the entire Northeast with these spongy moths. We're worried about the spread. If these things get out of the Northeast and spread over into the Midwest and into the Northwest, it's going to be a very serious problem. It already is in the Northeast. It could get way worse. When I was talking about those grain moths, we are the biggest transporters of invasive species across the world. No other species has ever had the connectivity and the ability to transport between continents. And so we're carrying these things inadvertently all the time. We have things in place to sort of prevent that. APHIS, for example, is one of those organizations that designed to prevent the import of certain things. But we miss it. And of course, things go back to this is from the 19th century. So late 1800s, this guy was trying to do this, and spongy moths have been around since then. When we transport wood, I'm sure you guys have seen signs if you're campers at all. Don't take wood from other places. That's the best advice you can have. When you transport this anywhere else, you're likely carrying anything else that's inside of it to a different place to potentially reinfect a new area. We're also providers of food sources. Look, if I only eat one thing and you guys grow that one thing in this abundance, I'm going to be there. I'm going to be there. And not only am I going to be there, but I'm going to be there in huge numbers because my goodness, what an excellent source of food that is. And so a lot of the problems that we have, a lot of the pestilent issues that we have with moths, they're our own fault. They're our own fault because of the systems that we have generated in order to support ourselves. Now, it is important to control these things, and it is important to grow food. So there are certain things that we just can't, you can't just fold and say, well, maybe we grow differently. There's a lot that goes into how we grow things, and it's important to recognize that, hey, we contribute as much to their pestilence. And of course, the definition of what a pest is derived entirely from human perspective. It's also important to remember that we also provide really good shelter. I tried to find a cartoon image of Jerry standing outside freezing while Tom's sitting inside next to a fire. And then, of course, Tom opens the door, lets Jerry in. But I couldn't find a picture, so I just drew this really nice looking fireplace. I wish I had a fireplace that looked like that, and then I would have a really nice place to hang out if I had a snowstorm. And so our warm houses over the winter, if they would otherwise freeze and die over the winter, well, we've provided them the resource to stay alive. Now, their beneficial roles, they're far greater, and they're far more important, if you ask me. But there's not a monetary contribution here. Oftentimes we kind of have to do derivations like, okay, well, this leads to this, leads to this, so here's the value, which it's not as direct as saying they ate $1 billion worth of food. So food sources for a huge variety of things, your birds, your lizards, of course, bats and other insects. But they're also food sources for humans. So these are large caterpillars. This is in Asia. They have a diverse diet over there. I'd sure love to try some things. I'm not sure how appealing this works. This is some sort of stir fry. This one looks great. This one maybe not so much, but I would try it. And this happens to be the most expensive pound for pound fungus in the world. It's grown out of these silk moth caterpillars in Tibetan mountains. So interesting relationship there. A small amount of that would sell for thousands of dollars. And it's usually used for medicine, not for food. But moths are incredibly efficient pollinators. You saw the pictures of the hairs being covered in pollen, their proboscis being covered in pollen. Well, they love nectar. I mean, that's why they evolved these proboscis. And they visit a huge variety of different flowers. Even when they're kind of on their way out, they'll still give a visit. And I mean, like, really, really good pollinators. If you noticed, Tim had some flowers behind him when we started. This is a picture of mine and research that I did for my doctorate in studying the efficiency, the benefit of nocturnal visitation to apple flowers. Um, and so this is an animal, this is a true armyworm, something that's very well known as being a problematic pest in some agricultural environments, visiting an apple flower and doing an exceptionally good job at pollinating it, actually. Potentially as much as 5 times better, more efficient than some of the bees that we're visiting during the day. So, an incredible animal doing some incredible work, with the caveat of, as larvae, they are really destructive, as is the case for many of these other ones. But loads of flowers, loads of different types, very good pollinators and human enrichment. So this is black lighting. I did some of this last week to sort of get people interested in moths because, as Tim mentioned, this is National Moth Week. So I hope you guys are at least trying to enjoy some of it. But science in the lab, it's in our culture. The gentleman there was raising a was rearing death's head moths. If you didn't know that, it is a real type of moth. This is an exaggeration. This is actually the skull on the inside. It's not quite that obvious. That is actually an image of a skull, of people arranging themselves that the artist there pulled in and put over the moth. Otherwise, the moth looks very much like this. It's just that skull is not so clear. And here you see me. That's the same moth you saw earlier. Oh man, I geeked out. So this is it's the first Cecropia that I have ever seen. I've looked for them. You always try to find the big Saturniids. If you look at this sheet, they're loaded with Saturniids and Trypanids, which are really tough to find. But here I've got this lovely Cecropia. This is a female. She emerged in my backyard. They don't fly all that well. So when they first emerge, they'll climb to a high point and they emit a pheromone that attracts the males in. Males can smell it from about 2 to 3 miles away and they'll come in from that far. So I put her in a high place. I found her the next day. She was in copulus or reproducing with a male that had found her, and she was in copulus for the whole day. So kind of an event for them, but supporting the next generation just by being excited. And gosh, you can see how much I nerded out on that. So some philosophical perspectives, and I've kind of already started indoctrinating you. The idea is that I'm trying to share information and share my line of thought so that you guys can follow along. But what is good and bad? What is pest? What is a beneficial animal? These are things. Moths just do what they do, and if they affect humans in any way, if it's good, they're beneficial. If it's bad, they're a pest. Well, that doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense because there are a lot of things out there that do just what they do, and they may have some effect if we did things differently. So, really, what again it comes down to is the way that we do things really defines what a pest and what a beneficial is. So, what if a group is dynamic? What if a species is both? Well, actually, as it turns out, moths are very commonly both pests and beneficial. And so, how does this play out across the board for humans? Moths, to me, if they eat a plant that I'm interested in, I'll regulate their population so they don't just destroy everything and take away what I might get out of that plant. But at the same time, somebody else might look at it and see just one and think, okay, they're terrible. So we're not unified in the way we perceive pest and beneficial. My concept here is that these are fragments, human constructs of the way that we want to view things, and they don't really add up. And individual perspectives are not unified. I have varying degrees. For example, if I had a clothes moth, that thing is definitely a pest. I'm going to try to kill it. I don't want it in my clothes. I don't want it to clothes cost money. I don't want to lose those clothes. So how they affect us again is everything, and it's confusing. The bottom line again, moths just do what they do, and that has value, and so we need to treat them for what they're doing in the moment. Remember, they have 4 life stages. The caterpillar is the one that's doing a lot of the vegetative damage on plants. Let's control those as much as we can in a way that's not going to just destroy their entire population, because we do want the adults to come out because a lot of those adults are really good pollinators and we want that. So it's really important to try to take it in stream. And so let's look at some Midwest moths here. We'll look at some numbers over there in Wisconsin. These Look, these are estimates. I think they're all pretty low. Missouri is about right, so greater than 3,000 here. Wisconsin, if I had to guess, being close to the lakes here, you guys, I would say probably over 2,000 species. South Dakota, it's probably closer to 1,500 species. This is where I'm from. And so a lot of these, bottom line, moths are so poorly studied that we don't really know how many of them are out there, and we don't even know what they feed on. So there are a lot of undescribed moths. There are a lot of moths that exist in areas. It doesn't make sense that we would have an estimate of 1,400 for North Dakota, 1,300 for Nebraska, and about a third for South Dakota in between these two states. That doesn't make sense. So clearly we're missing a lot of data. Estimated numbers. Their winter survival varies. Sorry about that. Let's go back. Their winter survival varies. This was supposed to come in on a click, but that's okay. Um, some of them survive as eggs. Some of them survive as larvae here. Behind this map here, you'd see pupae or a chrysalis. Sometimes they survive as that as well. Um, so few will survive as moths if they can find a nice warm place, or as adults. Few will find a warm place that they can hang out in, but several, excuse me, several migrate. And so we find in the spring, and you can actually monitor these. There's a lot of ad companies that have monitoring stations that monitor the import or the incoming moths, because you can spray your plants prior to, in order to prevent these animals from laying eggs and then eventually destroying your crops. So there are monitoring places that observe these things as they come in, and oftentimes it's from the northeastern part of Mexico, where they tend to spend their winters, and then they'll move up as the year. So these oftentimes in the spring you get these favorable south winds that blow northward. Well, as a moth, if you can just spread your wings a little bit and pick up on that, turns out moths migrate as far as 2,000 kilometers in just a few nights. So very short duration, they can go from Mexico all the way up into Canada. These are some ancient moths. We're probably not going to see these. I wouldn't advertise or promote you guys to try to support these. You're probably not going to see them. Micropterigids are particularly, they're mostly tropical moths. There are numerous ones, but they're often associated with trees with very large flowers. You don't really find that here. Magnolias, but as far as I know, there are no Macropterigids associated with magnolias in North America, but there may be. Nonetheless, very shiny, very attractive. They're extremely small. You wouldn't even notice that it's a moth. You might think it's just like a fly or a gnat, but when you get a good close look, there's a lot of color, there's a lot of diversity going on. And these guys have mandibles, so they're feeding on pollen most as adults. And then we get into incurvarioidea, or the here we got Prodoxids, so your yucca moths, and then we've got your adelids, or your fairy moths. Fairy moths because they got extremely long antennae, and when they fly, they sort of flutter, and they're also extremely attractive when you get close. Probably again, you're probably not going to see these. You wouldn't even recognize them if you got them, but they're really neat. They're really attractive. Micro moths. If you get into them, that's where the diversity in moths are, and that's where you really start to see some extremely beautiful things. It's nice to see something big and showy, but the small ones, they're super cool. So we look here, now we're starting to get into things that we might recognize as moths. So we're going to have some paralids here, some snout moths here, and then your crambids, which are considered flower moths. And so these animals, crambids, are some of the most common floral visitors around the world, and they are well worth supporting. The grass moths, these things feed on grasses as caterpillars, and they'll visit flowers, but not nearly as much as some of these other ones will. So when you see some of this sort of long snout, you're probably looking at a crambid or a paralid. Your underwings, your family Erebidae. This is a very common family. It's kind of a catch-all group. They kind of lumped everything in here. So this is an underwing moth. You can see it's got a completely different coloration under its wing. This is its hind wing. It's often got reds, oranges, yellows, and it's a flash display. It'll spread its wings when it feels threatened to kind of display this color, not only to say, hey, I'm not that tasty, but also kind of frightened. You can see that this almost looks like a little eyes here. They also exude fluid. Um, I've gotten squirt by these things. You mess with them too much, if they have enough, they will spray you, and it stinks really bad. This is a type of tiger moth, really common. You'll probably find one. You can find them in Wisconsin. This is a leopard moth. It's another type of tiger moth. You are able to find these in Wisconsin. Keep an eye out for them. You can see the metallic blue and orange here. Their caterpillars are not unlike, they're very similar to the woolly bears. So if you've seen woolly bears, it turns into a white tiger moth. A woolly bear looking thing turns into this here leopard moth. This is a white marked tussock moth. These things are really common. The caterpillars red on the upper side with these tufts of white with very long hairs that come out the front and sometimes the back. Tussock moths are pretty cool. And this is just a common leaf litter moth. It's a type of a rabbit. You'll find these probably more common than anything else, and identifying them can be very difficult if an identity has even been established. So keep that in mind. Owlet moths, these are going to be, in my experience, your most prolific feeders. That's because it's a massive group, and almost every single one of them will visit a flower. We've got a huge range of different colorations, different kind of gestalt the overall appearance of things. Wide variety of host plants as larvae, but oftentimes they visit just, good nectar sources. If you think it's a good nectar source for a bee, it's probably a good nectar source for moth. Point out, this is Heliocoverpa zea. If you've ever heard of the corn earworm, that's what it turns into. And this has been, in my observations, one of the most important pollinating moths that exists in the United States. An interesting duality of being one of the most problematic for crops that we grow, but also one of the most important pollinators. Sphingids, these are things that we often consider to be floral visitors and very good at pollination. Well, the way that they visit is not necessarily conducive for pollination, but they are good pollinators. If you remember that picture that I showed you with all the pollen on the face, that was a type of sphinx moth or a sphingidy. Snowberry clearwing, you can see this guy. If you guys don't recognize that, this is Monarda or bee balm. Very good nectar plant. Some of these night blooming flower species, your whites, it's a really good color for moths. But you also get, some of these other animals just for their sheer beauty. This is one that you can find in Wisconsin. Just Pandora's moth, absolutely beautiful. White-lined sphinx moth, one of the most important pollinators as well, and a migratory animal. This is a day-flying snowberry clearwing moth. Also really cool. Saturniids, these are your big beauties, super flashy, not very good flyers. Largest moths in North America, largest moth in the world is an Actius moth, and that is something very closely related to the Cecropia. In fact, the Cecropia is the largest moth in North America. Most of these guys don't feed. They don't have mouth parts as adults. They feed exclusively as larvae. Their adult form is almost entirely for reproduction. So it's great to support these animals because they're big, they're beautiful, they make for great stories, but they will not pollinate your flowers as well as you might want them to. Here's some resources I'd like you guys to just to check into. This is not a comprehensive caterpillars of Eastern North America. A lot of the moths, caterpillars that you're going to find in there are going to be found here. David Wagner's done really well. He's the only one that's done some rearing of caterpillars to find out what their moths are and generated a book from it. Peterson generates really good guides in general. Their guide to field moths. I would get the Northeastern North America. There's only two out right now, Southeastern, Northeastern. But you'll find most of the species that you can find in Wisconsin and Peterson as the adults, Peterson Field Guide. So have a look. And have a look at these websites as well. Bug Guide is incredible. It's hard to navigate. It's not necessarily for your average user. Butterflies and Moths is, and it's very good for it. iNaturalist is as well. Use these resources. This is probably one of my favorites, this Great Lakes Org resources. That was an incredibly like a very good quick look at what animals you might find in Wisconsin. So by all means, check out that Great Lakes Moths org.resources or /resources. Just some quick tips here before I end the show. When in doubt, the more common animal is far more likely. So if you're looking at something you're like, oh, hey, maybe it's the rare one, probably not. So it's almost always the more common one. Use multiple image. If you're going to take pictures, Try to get pictures from multiple angles. We really want a good look of the whole body for comparison. The overall look is really important. Gestalk, how they hold their wings. Are they holding their arms above their heads? Are their wings spread out like this geometrid here, or are they folded back on them? So, and use multiple sources. Don't just use one. We're gonna skip real quick through this, and really what I'm gonna say for managing what it comes down to: be patient, be intentional about your design, incorporate diversity. You're not just looking for one. You're not just looking to feed the adults. Make sure you're feeding the larvae as well. If you really want them to be around, make sure you're feeding the larvae, and don't sell yourself short. Things like this, if you guys don't recognize that, that is Western poison ivy. I don't I'm not advertising or advocating that you cultivate this plant, but there are animals that feed on this exclusively. In fact, this is a snowberry, and this is your snowberry clearwing picture I showed you earlier. And this is a very rare type of moth that you don't usually see. The larvae feed specifically on as a host plant, toxic dendrons. So your poison ivy, really interesting. This is yarrow up here, and so all over the board, lots of really good plants. 160,000 species of moths in the world, maybe 2,000 in your area. Well, guess what? They're going to feed on just about anything you plant. There's probably a moth that will feed on it, unless it's a completely exotic plant. So keep that in mind always. For your adults, long corollas, pretty flowers. In general, here's what I say. Diversity, and if it's said to be good for bees, it's probably going to be good for moths as well. Your blazing star, your pale purple, your eka, your yes, even your I'm blanking on the name here, but your thistle, your thistles are extremely good nectar plants. So make your decisions carefully. Don't introduce invasive or noxious weed species, but keep in mind that things that we consider, again, it's totally based on human perspective. So diversity, and across the board, just try to control the light, try to control plant diseases that might affect the caterpillars themselves, and also regulate those numbers. If you're growing food plants, you don't want 50 caterpillars just tearing into your plants. So keep that in mind as you generate moth gardens and you are supporting these animals. These are our civil rights slides, both in English and in Spanish here. Here's contact information. Please feel free to contact me anytime. I'm sure you got some local resources that may be better with some local identification, but if you ever feel the need, by all means, email me with a picture and I'm more than happy to help. And with that, I will end, and I'll leave this slide up for just a second.
Well, Dr. Robertson, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. It was very comprehensive. You answered a bunch of my questions that I had. So we do have a few questions here in the chat or in the Q&A box. So we'll cover as many of those as we can, but it was a very great presentation. Really appreciated that. Okay, so we do have, so in one of your last slides, you showed lighting. So is there anything homeowners, our focus is a little less ag production and a little more backyard homeowner landscapes. And is there anything for lighting, for light protection from moths at night that could help encourage them?
Sure. Me. I thought that was going to take me right to the slide. Um, Really what it amounts to is the more natural lighting, which is to say the darker, oftentimes the better. So yes, we want to be safe. We want to be able to provide safe environments for us to be able to walk around. Oftentimes one of the moves that you're seeing from cities is putting hoods over the tops of lights so that the ambient light is restricted to just go straight downward. There are also some lower lights that you can still get visible light for you without interfering with the moths themselves. So look for low lighting. Look for some regulation. You don't want lights that are just, an uncovered bulb that's just shining light everywhere, unless you're trying to attract moths. And you don't want a night garden that looks like this here. This is that's a bit much. So
Yeah, is there a timing issue with that? Do moths come out earlier or later in the evening, or is it kind of all
oh,
evening?
It really just depends on temperatures, humidity, some environmental factors. In my research, I found that yes, moths are periodic. And so you get a huge influx of animals that are visiting flowers in the early part of the evening. I'm imagining it's kind of like breakfast, you know. So they're waking up, they need a little bit of energy in order to fly around for the evening in order to find a mate and lay eggs. So um, yes, early in the evening tends to be their most important feeding time, but moths feed throughout the evening as well. And so, you know, the time that we need the light the most is going to be around dusk. Regulate that light as best you can. Turn those lights off before you go to bed.
Sure. Kind of along those same lines, what about outdoor other, attributes we as, humans might put in the environment, such as wind chimes or bug zappers or, anything else that might disrupt their overnight flight patterns?
One of the things that could potentially be problematic is the use of pesticides. There's some evidence that even using certain herbicides can have, just like with bees, you know, you're talking about um, additive effects over time. Maybe alone they don't do anything, but in combination with a fungicide, well, now it's going to have problems on the metabolism or the physiology of the moths, potentially kill them. Um, you definitely don't want to spray late in the evening. If anything's in bloom, just don't put anything on it. Let it go. Yeah. As far as wind chimes, not going to be a problem there. Bug zappers, you're going to kill moths. I'm sure we've all like seen a bug zapper and you walk by and that big one flies in and it's not just a it's a and then you see a flame a little bit and the moth falls. So yes, bug zappers will definitely kill moths. You can get some that have cages that will prevent some moths, but again, we're talking micro moths that could be very small and extremely rare and potentially threatened species that we just wouldn't know get killed by those things. So, in general, I would say don't use bug zappers, but mosquitoes, I know they can be super problems. So you got to weigh it out, right?
Right, right. Here's a specific question about maybe a type of moth or a type of butterfly. Do you know of any species that feed on burning nettle in the Midwest?
I
They're
don't.
black and pretty spiky was the question. Maybe it was a butterfly.
I see. Was that
Anything
it
springs
sounds
to
like
mind?
maybe a caterpillar was feeding. Let's see. Burning nettle. So one thing that's really important to remember is again, there's thousands of species of I see. So if you're talking about the stinging nettle caterpillar, I do not believe that one is in North America. I could be wrong about that. Yes. Very spiky, toxic animal. You don't want to touch it, but I believe its distribution is outside of North America. You're probably not going to find it here.
Okay. So it might have been something different they were seeing if they saw it locally. So you
Could be.
mentioned moths being, besides great pollinators, also great food sources for our birds. Is that always the case? Do they have some chemicals or compounds that might make them less desirable?
Definitely. So again, I'm going to refer back to the numbers here. 160,000 species in the world. There are plenty of them out there that are. It's just like monarchs. Monarchs, you'll see we'll say a blue jay come in. It'll take a monarch once. Once it has that tummy upset, it'll never take a monarch again. Well, it's the same thing in moths, but you kind of have to have that association. Um, so the birds that are flying around during the day, if they catch a moth, a lot of those are going to be completely edible and quite nutritious. And there are some birds out there that are almost exclusive that just tear off their wings and eat the adult moths or seek out the caterpillars. So, and not all birds eat insects. So it's kind of a mixed bag, and it really just depends on what you're looking at. Your warblers will eat moths. The picture that I showed there was actually of a yellow rump warbler, something that you'll find. Your yellow warblers will eat moths as well. So by supporting moths, you are supporting larger vertebrates that will feed on these things.
Right. So tying into that, some of the things we encourage at Extension is ties into some of your expertise is actually pesticide application, considering those different facets of, we are also feeding our birds as well. So how do you generally approach that? And you've kind of talked about it a little bit. You want to control populations, but for the average, homeowner, not thinking of an agricultural situation, but what is your recommendation usually?
Well, as much as I criticize the human perspective is adding into what defines a pest or a beneficial, I mean, really, that's what it comes down to. And again, you're talking about larvae are the ones that are going to, if you're growing food plants out in your backyard, if you're growing flower plants and you get a group of caterpillars to come in, it's the caterpillars that are going to be the destructive ones. And so what I would generally do, like if I had a tomato plant and I had three tomato hornworms, that plant's not going to support three. I will just pluck off two with my bare hands. I will kill them. I'll smash their heads and make sure that they die quickly. And then I'll leave the other one to do its job. Yes, it's going to defoliate a decent amount of the tomato. I will watch closely if I need to transfer it to a different plant. But the idea there is kind of weighing out your loss versus the benefits. So what I try to do is it's for my own sake, right? So I've got cabbage plants and I've got cabbage whites that are terrible for them. When they get numerous, I'll put down BT, but if it's just like 5 to 10, I'll go in, hand pluck, I'll leave one. So cabbage whites are not in any kind of threat. So there's plenty of them out there, but just for my part, I usually like to leave one or two just to kind of support the population.
Excellent. So I'm going to take just a second here to remind all of our participants, thank you again for joining us today. Before you go, we'd love for you to fill out our survey that Amy has dropped in the chat. So check out that link. Please fill out our survey to help us inform future programming. Dr. Robertson, I think we have time for a couple more questions. I'm going to try to sneak a couple more in here.
Sure.
You mentioned invasive species and moths and how certain moths can have an effect on certain species of plants. I had a question here. Do you have any evidence or seen any research on moths that could work advantageously against things like buckthorn and honeysuckle, other, prolific invasives in our landscape?
So I know that we used, and I'll try to keep things brief so we can get more questions in. In short, biological control is a very common way of doing things. Caterpillars don't seem to be that good for it. It's hard. It's hard to get them to do what we want them to do. They'll do a little bit of it and then they escape and then probably go somewhere else and die. So it's not the most effective, but I'm sure with a little bit of effort and a little bit of very intentional focus that yeah, you could probably control, but not broadly. You're not going to save the world from a weed.
Right. So, considering this is National Moth Week and folks are very interested in observing these moths and they're happening at night, we saw your photo of the sheet. Do you have any recommendations on the best way to observe some of these moths in the
Best
evening? Is
way.
that a good thing?
Yep. So everything I said about light pollution, throw that out the window. If you're actually trying to bring them in, those light sources are really good. So really, what you're looking for is UV radiation that emits a wavelength that they seem to really like. Mercury vapor lamps. It's a wide range, but it's extremely effective on bringing moths in. And what you want to do is you want to put these lights with a background of a white sheet. And so if you have a tube light, for example, black light, you lean it against a sheet, and then these animals will come in and as they're attracted, they'll land on the sheets. And yeah, take a good look at them. If you've got a strong street light, you could probably go out there and look at those. You may not get a good look at it, but if you have an outdoor like a porch light, you might bring them in there. So always check those. I always do when I'm on walks. I'll invade somebody else's front porch just to see if they've got a cool moth. So anywhere you can see them, and if you're looking to bring them in, black light or mercury vapor, it gets expensive to get into that hobby, but you can look into it by all means.
Well, we encourage everybody to get out there and take a look this evening. Dr. Robertson, it's 1 o'clock, so we've reached our time, but we really appreciate you being here today and sharing all of your knowledge with us on moths. And again, get out there and check out those moths. And please, again, check out our survey, give us some feedback, and we'll pass it on, and the recording will be ready in about a week. So, Dr. Robertson, thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. Enjoyed it.
All right. Bye now.
Bye.